My name is Aldo Fonseca. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. I want to thank you all for joining us today at the 2021 Critical Technology and Intelligence Summit. Now, what we're going to be discussing today is essentially the nexus between cyber warfare and also how, cyber attacks and cybersecurity, and how it has sort of permeated all aspects of national security. And with us today, we're going to have two very excellent speakers and people who are intricately familiar with this current topic. We're lucky to have with us Brian Fonseca, who's the director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy, as well as the director of cyber here at FIU. So he's sort of putting together all the cyber programs under one big umbrella, one sort of collective effort to make sure that FIU is at the forefront of this discussion. Speaking with him today and discussing the topics is going to be Dr. Alex Crowther. Dr. Alex Crowther is a senior research professor for cyber here at JGI, and we're going to hear from them about their thoughts on the current situation. And what I'd like to do before we even get into the discussion itself is I'd like to make an announcement. For those of you that are familiar with JGI and those of you who are not familiar with JGI, I'd like to invite you to participate in our Insider's Guide to Careers in National Security. Now, if you're here, it means that the concept and the topic itself has piqued your interest. That's step one. Step two is to turn that interest into a full-fledged career as an intelligence practitioner, and that's what JGI is good at, right? We have an exclusive ICCA Intelligence Fellowship program that is accepting applications to its 2022 cohort, and these are students that are dedicated to a career in the intelligence community. What we do is provide them mentorship, guidance, professional development, and exclusive access to intelligence community representatives, right? So if you feel that intelligence career is something that you want to pursue, but you're not really certain how to do that, come talk to us here at JGI. We're experts on the subject, a lot of great people who are knowledgeable and help you start that path. So what I'm going to do is, after I've introduced our guests, I'm going to drop in a link into the chat so that you can register in the landing page and join us on October 8th for that Insider's Guide to Careers in National Security. All right, that being said, I want to open up this 2021 CTI Summit. And I'm just going to start off, I'm going to go in hot. I'm going to go in hot with a question for both of our speakers. And I'd like to bring Dr. Crowther and Brian online. Please unmute yourselves, get ready. Sir, traditionally, cybersecurity and cybersecurity related issues have always been centered around the sort of abstract concept for most Americans. It's something that happens where information is leaked, where passwords and our geopolitical rivals use it for an intelligence advantage or to embarrass us on the national stage. However, as cyber capabilities have developed, as our geopolitical rivals have become more adept at the use of cyber attacks and cyber weapons, are we seeing a change in the dynamic? Are we seeing the inevitable crossing over from cyber warfare to actual warfare? What is the line that can be crossed? Will it be crossed? Who are our biggest rivals in this arena? And how can we protect ourselves in the future from such attacks? Sir, Brian, Director Fonseca, I'm going to kick it off to you. Let's get your thoughts first, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Aldo. Definitely, you're the smarter of the Fonsecas on this side, but I appreciate the opportunity to join this group today to talk a little bit about conflict in cyberspace, and then hopefully we'll sort of evolve to looking more broadly at the impact of technologies on the intelligence career field, and overall sort of space of conflict. And so Alex and I have long sort of gone back and forth in talking about conflict in cyberspace. In fact, many a times we would argue over sort of concepts that were kind of out there and evolving rapidly in this new environment. So there's a lot to unpack from your question. So Alex, perhaps you and I can take a first shot at that piece on sort of cyber war, cyber conflict. And I think starting there, and I'll toss to you in a minute, Alex, but starting there, it's important to sort of disaggregate the concept of cyber war and cyber warfare. So cyber warfare is essentially understood as a domain of warfare. And so, to your question, Aldo, it's cyber's already comprised in contemporary notions of conflict and sort of what you called sort of regular warfare. It's all happening in these domains of warfare. And so today's today's military organizations must operate sort of this multi-domain operational environment. It's interesting because historically militaries fought in three primary domains. That was air, land, and sea. And of course, there's been these historical, and I was talking to one of our colleagues, historical examples of cross-domain operations throughout history. There's always someone we talk about, multi-domain operations being sort of a new concept. Somebody would say something along the lines of, in ancient Greece, someone shot a catapult from a barge at sea and the projectile flew through the air and hit something or someone on land, and boom, you have cross-domain operations, air, land, and sea, right? But that's not kind of how we think about it today. But it's not terribly off. In other words, we think of multi-domain operations or these different spaces in which we compete and fight for ultimately what we think are the end objectives, which if you listen to Thucydides, it's honor, fear, or interest. And so we use these domains of warfare to pursue honor, fear, interest. And so cyber is increasingly being understood. Actually, it was recognized as the fifth domain of warfare. And so it's what we call sort of domains of warfare. So it's a form of warfare, right, in which cyber is taking place, or that fight is taking place in cyberspace. That often gets confused and often interrelated with sort of the notion of cyber war, which is essentially defined as sort of the entire conflict is fought in cyberspace. And to that end, I'm going to ask Alex, I'm going to toss over to Alex, but this idea of we know cyber warfare is happening. You talked about actors, the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese, the Iranians, were all sort of in that space as state actors. There's a plethora of non-state actors also fighting in that domain for influence or interests. And so that is pretty well understood today that cyber warfare is or the domains of warfare is inclusive of cyber, as well as things like space and electromagnetic spectrum, et cetera. But that's different than the concept of cyber war, which is that a conflict is fought entirely in cyberspace. And I think that's highly unlikely that you'll see cyber war, and whether or not it even exists, I don't think is a thing. But Alex, let me kick it over to you, because oftentimes, again, those two terms get used interchangeably, and they mean very different things. And we have to understand, appreciate, I think, and how those are defined in the relative context of conflict in cyberspace. So what do you think?
So since Brian has mentioned Thucydides, that means I'm cleared hot to mention Karl von Clausewitz, right? Who in his classic on war talked about, what is war, right? And war is a violent event. This is me paraphrasing Karl now. A violent event meant to cause your opponent to do your will or to gain your policy objectives, okay? And so cyber operations are not strong enough yet to be a war by itself. The only thing that we have that can achieve your policy objectives by itself are nuclear weapons. So there is such a thing as nuclear war, but there's no such thing as carrier war or armored division war or anything like that, because that's all warfare. That's how you fight, right? And so there is cyber warfare, which is happening on a daily basis now, but there is no such thing as cyber war, because you cannot force your opponent to do your will via only operations in cyberspace.
So that puts an end to that, and hopefully, the group here sort of recognizes and appreciates this idea that cyber war, when you hear it tossed out there, is just not a thing, right? It's really cyber warfare, and it becomes a domain in which we fight. And what that means, though, is that what's changing, back to Aldo's question, what's changing is the tools and tactics we use to fight in cyberspace, right? There's a rapidly evolving portfolio of tools that we use to gain competitive advantage over rivals and adversaries that are exclusive to cyberspace as a domain in which we're going to compete. As Alex said, as an extension of our political interest. And so as those tools continue to rapidly change, so too does the amount of emphasis placed on those tools to help us win, broader, competitions in terms of global conflict and broader geopolitics. And Alex is spot on. Nuclear war was a thing because you could press a button, drop a big bomb, and it ended the conflict, and it was fought and over, through sort of nuclear means. It's just not the way you can achieve it today. Cyberspace, it's interesting. People used to argue that cyberspace didn't offer a whole lot of lethality when you think about conflict and fighting. In fact, I used to have a colleague that would walk around and say that there were more squirrels in the United States, or more people died in the United States from a squirrel falling on their head than a cyber attack, right? And historically, there's truth to that. Paul Rosenzweig, by the way, Alex, you know him. And there's a lot of truth to that, right? The lethality of cyber, cyber attacks is very low. Now, about a year and a half ago, I think it was in Germany, where there was a hospital that suffered a cyber attack, and it did get mapped to the loss of life, thereby sort of changing to some degree conflict. Go ahead, Alex, jump in.
One woman lost her life. It was September of 2020. It was in Germany, and somebody did a ransomware operation on a hospital, and she died because she couldn't get the medical care that she needed. So, that actually meets the criteria of being an armed attack in cyberspace, right? Where you have to achieve one of four effects, essentially, which is property is damaged, property is destroyed, people are hurt, people are killed. And so the Germans actually could have done something about that, but they chose not to.
That's right. So now that changes sort of the nature of how we think about cyberspace in terms of its potential for lethality, right, to cost lives. But still, by and large, the loss of life, is relatively limited with cyber as an instrument of warfare. And so that means states are going to continue to need to rely on other, instruments of warfare to fight, whether that's ground, so land, air, sea, space. And so all of these domains are now, are hot for conflict. And the more sophisticated you can leverage a mix of these domains, the more likely you're going to compete well in the conflict space. And so,
if I may interject, because I think you raised an important point, I'd like to follow up with a question for the both of you. And you mentioned a case study that of the hospital in Germany, and what other factors besides lethality can constitute? And I think Dr. Crowther, you mentioned some others. What other factors besides lethality constitutes what we can say is cyber warfare permeating into what is traditionally known as regular warfare, right? And how is a colonial pipeline attack fit into that dynamic?
So the colonial pipeline attack is a criminal operation, not an armed attack in cyberspace. The phrase armed attack comes from the UN Charter. The other phrase that they use is use of force. And if you read the Tallinn manual, they define what is an armed attack in cyberspace. And again, you've got to achieve one of four effects. Stuff is damaged, stuff is destroyed, people are hurt, people are killed. So there are people who say there's never been an armed attack in cyberspace. There are people who say Stuxnet is the only one that's achieved that because it resulted in the destruction of the centrifuges in Iran. There are others who say the 2012 Shamoon virus in Saudi Arabia because the end result was 30,000 destroyed hard drives. There are others who say, no, that wasn't an armed attack in cyberspace because the Saudi government decided to destroy those hard drives to prevent the virus from going out. The fact that we can call these out by name means there aren't very many of them, right? And Brian's exactly right in pointing out that this woman in Germany is the first one that we've seen in the developed world where someone has died as a result of a cyber operation.
And by the way, Stuxnet was largely attributed to sort of kicking off this idea of cyber conflict, right? A lot of people point back to that, that case study in Iran as a means of offensive cyber capability to achieve some type of political means, right? And in there, although to your question, I think, again, if lethality is out of the mix, how then is cyber, supposed to help achieve, objectives in conflict? And there's a variety of ways that we've seen it, at least in broader competition. And this is an area that Alex and I have debated quite a bit. And I think he's probably more right than I am, but that is in sort of our concept of war altogether, right? And how we think about war. Oftentimes, cyber attacks don't necessarily muster up into the four criteria that he laid out that is exercised or at least laid out in the Talon Manual as part of the UN Charter. But stuff is going on in cyberspace, which is this contested space. It's the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese have all levied attack on American critical infrastructure in some form. And the question we often get asked is 2016, for example, right? Russian interference in the national elections. Is that an act of war or not? And this is where you have to break out, what we understood as sort of definitions of war and how we define war. That combined with sort of the resistance to want to label it war, because then it requires you to do something in response to it, right? If the administration came out and said that was an act of war and they went off the cuff on some new definition that sort of embraces cyberspace, then they would have had to act in some particular, proportional or non-proportional way. But again, there's this still, I think, a gray area, I know Alex disagrees a little bit, but gray area in terms of how we apply the traditional notions of war to these contemporary settings like cyberspace. So Alex, I know you got a lot to say on that. So you want to jump into it? We follow this all the time, by the way.
So the Talon Manual does define it, what is an armed attack in cyberspace. Interestingly enough, NATO and the United States do not. My analysis on the United States not doing it is that we're practicing a strategic ambiguity. Our opposition knows that there's a red line out there, but they don't know exactly where it is. Because honestly, to use a fictional scenario, if we defined an armed attack in cyberspace as killing 2 or more Americans, then the North Koreans would figure out how to kill 1 American with a cyber effect just to push up against the line. So strategic ambiguity is what we're doing, and we're going to continue to do that because the United States doesn't want to be bound. It's the Melian dialogue, right? Back to Thucydides, Athens and the city-state of Melios. Weak states do what they must. Strong states do what they will. And so you're not going to see the United States or China or Russia define what they think is an armed attack in cyberspace because they don't want to be forced to do anything.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I remember when Microsoft on the private sector was taking the charge on trying to push together a cyber treaty, and there was a lot of support around the world for a cyber treaty, but the ones that were absent were the big ones, right? China, Russia, the United States, who did not want to bomb. I mean, at the end of the day, the U.S. is thinking, well, we'll play by those rules, but we can't guarantee our adversaries are going to play by those rules, right? And so if we start to define this and limit our ability to navigate cyberspace to achieve objectives, against our national interest, then we could put ourselves at a serious disadvantage up against, major competitors in cyberspace that aren't going to play by those rules, even if they're defined, sort of under Western code. And so it's a great point. Yeah.
So Brian, that's an excellent point about, we would have to cleave to it because we're a rule of law nation, but they're a rule by law nation, so they don't have to. And there's a recent example of that, which is the Intermediate Nuclear Treaty.
That's right.
And
that's why
the INF Treaty. And the Russians had clearly violated, which is why we left the treaty, because we were restricted by it. The Chinese who hadn't signed it weren't, and the Russians weren't because they just cheated. And so you're exactly right, is we can't sign treaties that will limit us because it won't limit them.
And on that particular note, I have my first question from the audience I'd like to throw in there. And that is simply, has any type of cyber operation ever led to an actual kinetic conflict? And if it hasn't, is it inevitably on the horizon? And who do you think is going to be the first to perpetrate such an act?
Who's going to go on offense first?
Who's going to break? Who's going to cross that line? Someone's going to do it inevitably if we believe that cyber warfare will inevitably lead to kinetic
war. By killing that German woman, somebody has already crossed that line. Okay, but the Germans chose not to react to it, right? When I talk in my classes about this, I talk about, Chinese, Russians, North Koreans, Iranians do not want to kill Americans because what happened the last time somebody killed Americans? It was 9/11, a little bit over 20 years ago, and we've killed over 100,000 in each of Iraq and Afghanistan, and probably another 100,000 somewhere else around the world. We're still killing people because of 9/11. So they don't want to cross that line, and they understand that. And we don't want to be killing Russians and Chinese. You notice our offensive cyber operations when they hit the news are stuff like Cyber Command shuts down the Internet Research Agency during the midterm elections in 2018. Very clear target, very easy to defend. Hey, the IRA messed with the elections in 2016, so we're preventing them from messing with the elections in 2018. And that's defensible under international law. But I don't see the United States doing anything that's going to kill anybody, because that's really not our style.
Yeah, and it goes back, Aldo, to I think the question, it goes back to what Alex and I laid out as sort of the inspiration for war altogether, right? I mean, if you're conducting cyber operations, you're already in conflict, you're already in this contested space, right? You're leveraging cyber largely because it doesn't draw the same response as launching, aircraft for precision strikes or launching ground troops to invade a coast. And so cyber becomes an area in which you can play in this contested space. And because it's so ambiguous, it often helps you achieve objectives without taking you necessarily to full-scale war, right? Now, could there be a scenario in which when you map back to an invasion, a cyber attack is somewhere in the early origins? That's highly likely, because that's how nations are competing today. That's how they're fighting, right? Whether it's the Russians shutting down, American critical infrastructure, or the Americans shutting down the Russian energy grid, which we did a few years ago. And I remember the Washington Post did a really fascinating story on it. And I had a chance to talk to I'm trying to remember the name of the author. I think it was Adam. It wasn't Adam Siegel. It was Adam. There's another Adam that's writing for the Washington Post. I'll remember his last name in a moment, but he wrote this piece. He went to the US government and said, hey, we know that you're in the Russian energy grid. So we didn't shut it down, but we were in the energy grid. And we sort of acknowledged that we were in the energy grid. And he asked the US government, do you want us to not publish this? And US government said, no, go for it. And this was around the same time that Paul Nakasone was sort of, arguing hard around deterrence and go to point of origin of the fight. And so there was this messaging that was going on, essentially telling the Russians, hey, be careful, because we're in your energy grid. And here's where we are. But there's a lot of places that we're located where you won't know, and you don't know. And so it serves as a deterrent. And that was the effort, I think, on behalf of Nakasone and sort of US leadership. But we're already in this very contested space that could very well, continue to sort of pathway towards, maybe conflict that brings in other domains of warfare like air, land, or sea. But again, it goes back to what I said at the very early origin. It's part of the portfolio of tools that nations have today to compete and fight over political interests, right? And so, again, I think, yes, absolutely right. Cyber will be a part of that, that pathway to larger conflict. But I think that's inevitable, because it's an easy way to fight now that doesn't necessarily lead to full-scale invasion.
I think it was Adam Taylor, if memory serves, that was from the Washington Post. I'd have to check with you again, but he's written some articles. I know there's an Adam Taylor there from Washington Post. Yeah. And writes on foreign affairs, so I think that's who it is. Great. So I have another question from the audience, if I may. This comes from Danny. Great discussion, and given the changing nature of the international system that we find ourselves in, not least because of new cyber capabilities and capacities, do you believe that the U.S. national security posture is changing to a more traditional outlook in defining our interests? And I will open that to either of you.
Alex, you want to take a first swing, and then I'll...
I mean, our interests are our interests. And if you look at the national security strategy, they're very clearly defined. Democracy is good, free trade is good, human rights are good, stuff like that. And so that hasn't changed. Every once in a while, we'll add a new one, like human rights was added in the mid 1970s. democracy was added in the mid 1970s. Human rights was added in the mid 1980s under Reagan. And so I don't see a major change in what we do. We are the champions of those. Human rights, of course, include stuff like freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Those are all subsets of that. So those are the big three. They haven't changed. Every national security strategy talks to them. What changes is how we defend them. The Russians seek to disrupt the current global, mainly economic, but also political system, because they see it as being designed to keep them down, which indeed it was not. They were invited in, and Stalin chose not to go in. The Chinese want to replace the United States as what they think the United States is the global hegemon. So their goal is to replace the United States as the global hegemon. So they don't want to break the system. They want to change the rules so it's more advantageous to them. So when you see Russian cyber operations, you're looking at mainly information operations designed to break the EU, break NATO, and break our democratic institutions within our various countries, right? When you see the Chinese doing it, you're talking about major league intellectual property theft, information theft, which allows them to move their economy forward full bore, right? And so their techniques have changed. So our techniques of defense have changed. What we're defending isn't any different, but how we're defending it has changed significantly.
And I would add, Alex is absolutely right that, we've been pretty consistent about our foreign policy objectives for a very long time. The other thing that's changed in addition to how we fight is who we fight. To some degree, I think there's, and maybe this lends to where Danny was going, but sort of the resurgence of great power competition, right? And I'm not sure that ever went away entirely, but certainly, since the 70s, we anticipated the rise of China even as far back as the 70s. It's become far more real in the 21st century, sort of the rising capability of China. And so China's become, probably predictable, become the biggest preoccupation of American foreign policy. American security is the focus on China. And that's why you see so much coming out of the NSC that's focused on China. Russia hasn't gone away. It's been around for some time, but there was a point after the Cold War we kind of moved away from great powers, and that was because we were the only show in town. But there's been a resurgence in that, and I think to Danny's point, our national security posture has changed perhaps relative to where our competition is, and then leveraging the new tools like cyber, to outcompete or to sort of assuage the threat that these great powers pose to U.S. national interests over the short, mid, and long terms.
And one of those actors that you stated as developing its capabilities and is North Korea, of course. As you see their cyber capability advance and develop and perhaps get more bold, do you think North Korea sort of hops up on that list based on what their goals and objectives are?
No, personally, I think because I teach cybercrime, and so almost all North Korean cyber operations are criminal operations because of their rogue nuclear program. Rogue meaning not accepted by anybody in the world except China and Russia. There are heavy duty economic sanctions on them. So normally, if you need more money as a country, you do more trade and stuff like that, right? They don't have that option. So they historically have counterfeited $100 bills. They've run drugs, stuff like that. So what they've added to that is cyber capability. For instance, they tried to steal almost $1 billion from the Bank of Bangladesh a couple of years ago. They got away with $121 million, but Bangladesh managed to claw some of that back. Sorry, $101 million. They got back $82 million. So the North Koreans got away with $82 million. So, I mean, they've got to pay for their whiskey and stuff like that somehow. And that's how they're choosing to do it.
Director Fonseca, North Korea, criminal enterprise only, or will we see something more out of them?
I wouldn't put them in my sort of top tier of cyber powers in the world, right? And I'd be remiss if I'd question anyone that put them in that sort of top tier as a cyber power, to be able to sort of wield cyber in the international community to achieve, not criminal intent, but national interest, right? Which they're not entirely exclusive. Sanctions against North Korea has forced it to move into like the ransomware spaces, right? Where arguably, the WannaCry attack originated, and it didn't take more than a Sony picture, depicting the great North Korean leader in a bad light to sort of get them to respond in cyberspace with the Sony breach, which again was massive and important. But I don't necessarily put them on the same scale as the United States or Russia or China as cyber powers. I think they're way down the list. And it's interesting. So Adam Siegel, and I mentioned his name earlier. Adam Siegel, wrote a book called Hack World Order, which is a must read in my opinion. It's a fascinating book, and he takes a shot at looking at sources of power in cyberspace, right? And so he's one of the early ones to kind of look at power in cyberspace, and he essentially argued that there were 4 components to power in cyberspace. And they're what you might think. The first was a strong economic and technological base to work from, right? The second was the government's ability to work with the private sector. The third, which is really relevant to our discussion, is an adventurous and inventive military and intelligence capability, right? Where a lot of that capability sort of, spawns in terms of what you see commercialized in the cyber environment. The fourth was just an attractive narrative of cyberspace because he's writing this in the context of 2 competing, views of cyberspace, a state-centric versus a multi-stakeholder, right, environment. And you can think of Russia and China as very state-centric in terms of their governance over cyberspace. But he kind of articulates that. In doing all of that, he essentially argues that the United States is the cyber power, right? And there's no doubt that the U.S. has enormous offensive and defensive cyber capability. But he brings China and Russia sort of into the next tier of cyber capabilities. And then he has all the rest, essentially saying the rest are kind of, federated throughout the spectrum. But in general, if you listen to ODNI Clapper sort of first articulated the number, there were about 100 countries in the world developing offensive cyber capability. But again, they were way behind, the United States and China and Russia that were sort of out front. And so I don't put North Korea in that bag of sort of great cyber powers, but it has a cyber capability and it can do some damage with that cyber capability. I don't think it's strong enough or pervasive enough to, wield overwhelming influence against great powers like the United States or China. But it's significant enough to show up on the radar as a capability, right? As we saw with the Sony attacks.
And I think you touched upon an important subject there, which is capability. Now, we've been looking so far at foreign capability, but what about U.S. capability? And this is the next question from Richard Graham. According to the ODNI website, the 5 DoD services are listed as members of the IC. Is U.S. Cyber Command considered part of the IC? How do you view their current mission? And will they need to develop or change their capabilities?
So,
I'll start off with Dr. Crowther, and then Brian, we'll go to you afterwards.
So, Cyber Command is not part of the IC, but interestingly enough, the National Security Agency is, and General Paul Nakasone is the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency. As the commander of Cybercom, he commands one of the 10 combatant commanders around the world. These are the people that do combat operations on behalf of the United States. As the DERNSA, the director of the National Security Agency, he actually is not a cabinet level official, but he's up in that level. So it's very interesting. So the NSA, their job is to do signals intelligence. If Cyber Command was to do intelligence. That's what they would do. So no, they don't need to be part of the intelligence community. Let me cite since we're talking about cyber power and stuff like that, let me just bring up one document. It's called Cyber Capabilities and National Power, a net assessment from the International Institute of Security Strategic Studies, IISS, and it's from earlier this year. And they rate the United States as number one, clearly number one, right? Interestingly enough, they don't have a table that rates everybody, but pretty much everybody rates US number one. Number two is China, and interestingly enough, the UK. They usually rate Russia, Israel, and the Netherlands coming in behind them, and then everybody else. North Korea has a capability, but they don't have, in order to create, as Brian was talking about, create cyber power, you have to have human resources, right? You have to have an industry that does the internet and communications and information services, CIS stuff, and they don't have any of that, right? They actually do tests, diagnostic tests on their kids really early, and then they take them out and then put them on the internet. And so they just don't have the national capability to do that. Another country we haven't really mentioned is Iran, and they are operating in cyberspace, but it's mainly to try to get the US off their back. And their strategic goal in cyberspace is to, if the United States attacks, Iran thinks we're going to attack them, right? So in the case of the US attacking them, Iran wants to be able to shut down US command and control. So that's their whole goal in cyberspace, is to do that. And so they're in our banking system, they're in our critical infrastructure system, and they're mainly doing, practice runs to see how to break into the American system so that they can try to shut everything down in the case of an American attack on Iran.
Director Fonseca?
No, I think he's spot on. And I think I sort of levied my thoughts earlier on sort of North Korea, your earlier question.
So I have a question from one of our audience members, and it talks about the U.S. is using its abundance of resources in cybersecurity across multiple areas in terms of protection of private industry, protection obviously in military and capability, infrastructure, et cetera. But what role should society outside of the public sector play in protecting itself? We're talking about philanthropy, individual citizens, private organizations. How can they step up to play to make it a collective defense of U.S. interests at home and abroad? And now what we'll do is we'll start. Dr. Crowther, I gave you the first shot at it this time. I know you got some good thoughts. We're going to go back to Director Fonseca. We'll give him a first shot.
I can do this in 2 words, by the way.
No, do it, Alex. I'll add the words that you didn't add. Go for it.
Cyber hygiene. Cyber hygiene fixes 80 to 90% of your problems. That's according to the Australian Signals Directorate. Their NSA says cyber hygiene gets rid of 80% of your problems. Imagine a United States where 330 million people didn't click on the link. It would be wonderful from a security perspective.
A very clear, concise, and direct response. Director Fonseca, can you follow that up?
Yeah, I'll take that response. I mean, look, Alex and I have talked about this a lot. And as digital immigrants, like he and I are, sort of migrating to technology, we learned technology from a very different perspective that was very defensive and paranoid at the onset. Young people today are kind of born into the technology, and so they tend to take it for granted. But what Alex is saying about cyber hygiene is absolutely right. I think there's a culture shift that needs to occur in which people embrace good habits around cyberspace. The adage that people often use is the same way you brush your teeth, you change and protect your password, right? You have to build that hygiene into the way that you sort of manage and live in the digital space. And so I think largely that requires a culture change, right? In which I think, people start doing things instinctively and based on patterns of patterns of the, sort of right practices to do, to have in this cyberspace. So, I mean, at the end of the day, Alex is absolutely right. The overwhelming majority of citizens attacked in cyberspace is a result of lack of hygiene. Just they clicked on the kitty link, even though they didn't recognize who it came from, or their password was compromised on one system and they didn't change it on all the other systems, right? So there are basic things that ultimately open up the box to cyber threats. And I think, changing culture and building cyber hygiene is absolutely the way to go to protect that. And I think you're going to see, so if we go a little further and I pull the thread a little bit further on that sort of question about, overall protection, I think this is where you're also going to see the infusion of AI, I think, in a more sophisticated and robust way in the future to protect citizens as well as, governments from the threat of cyber. I mean, the ability to leverage AI to detect and patch, holes in your software, instantaneously is, I think, really powerful, right? If you can have machines and you take humans out of the loop, and machines can go and automatically mitigate once you're being attacked, we'll salvage so much of the losses that we render in cyber attacks. And so technology is going to continue to change in meaningful ways because we understand that there is such a massive delta between know-how in terms of cyber protection and the threat, which is rapidly growing as a result of, we didn't really talk about this. When you think about the attack surface, which is essentially the number of devices connected online, it's growing at an enormous speed. And that means that you're now far more vulnerable. I remember sitting in one of Alex's lectures, seemingly a decade ago, he would poll the class and ask how many devices were connected to the internet, 10 years ago. And people would say, well, maybe we had one connected device. Today, your TV's connected, your AC's connected, your microwave's connected, your alarm system's connected. You got an iPhone, an iPad, and a desktop and a laptop all connected. And so, you just do a quick survey of your house and you have multiple devices. That exponential increase in the threat landscape means that you have to protect yourself in exponentially more spaces. And unless you have the hygiene and built-in sort of, culture that or the technology coming from AI to mitigate those threats, then we're going to remain very, very vulnerable going forward.
Brian, you mentioned some of the technology that we're starting to see, play a larger role in this theater, but I want to take it back a little bit, and I just want you to define who are the combatants that exist now in this operational theater, right? When I think of a hacker, I think of somebody wearing a hoodie indoors in a basement, right? Is that an accurate description of the people waging these wars?
I mean, I'm sure there's a few people with hoodies in basements doing cyber attacks, but I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, no. In fact, you probably run into people that have the cyber hacking capability pretty routinely on the streets, and they look just like us, right? And they are us. They are us. They are us. And so, but I think to the question, which is really interesting, is that when you think about combatant, you close your eyes and you sort of picture a combatant. You're thinking of someone who's holding a rifle, wearing some camouflage utility, right? And is going off to fight. I think the 21st century combatant is a little different, and thanks in large part to cyberspace, right? Because that means that you take, for example, IT professionals in companies that are mapped to supply chains providing, the Department of Defense or the US intelligence community with technologies. And if that IT professional is not protecting that organization that's in that supply chain that maps to the US intelligence community, well, then they could create a huge space for an adversary to break in and ultimately, and we had a Bloomberg article surfacing a few years ago. I had some colleagues say that it was a little bit over embellished, but it was this idea that a Chinese firm was able to implant a chip the size. So the Bloomberg cover had a pencil with a little, chip at the tip of the pencil saying, this is what the Chinese planted in these motherboards, and these motherboards became part of the hardware that the CIA and other federal government, agencies were using to do their day-to-day business, right? Again, the U.S. intelligence community did not confirm that, but a couple of my colleagues said it was a little over embellished. But the point remains, and that is, if you have this massive supply chain that's supporting the Department of Defense, and it's very complex, and parts of that supply chain are hit by cyber attacks, it could sort of map all the way to Department of Defense and be critical in terms of its impact, right? And so I think the combatant of the 21st century is different in that it's not just those wearing fatigues, sitting on ships, flying aircraft, pounding the ground. It's also IT professionals, it's proxies, it's a whole variety of people that now have equities in fighting in cyberspace and have the ability, to bolster, whether knowingly or unknowingly, states' competition in cyberspace. So I think the combatant's different.
So, gentlemen, we're going to change gears a little bit because we're starting.
Hold on. Did Alex want to jump in on the combatant?
We wanted to jump in on that one?
Yeah. So
Right.
the last time a hostile power projected power onto the American continent was 14, if you count the Battle of New Orleans. The Germans couldn't do it. The Vietnamese couldn't do it. The Iraqis couldn't do it. But now, all of a sudden, you can do it. And so there is no safe rear area anymore. So when you talk about combatants on an offensive level, you're talking about cyber command, right? When you talk about combatants on a defensive level, that's 330 million people inside the United States of America. We're all defenders because they don't hack into Target, they hack into the HVAC company that has access to Target, right? The Iranians, remember I talked about them, they were hacking into dams in New York and banks and stuff like that. So everything that's connected to the internet is a vector, right? When I teach classes, I say this is the greatest threat to the individual in cyberspace. The greatest threat to a family is their router. And the greatest threat to a business is the insider threat. And so everyone is a combatant now.
A great point there, Dr. Crowther. And what I'd like to do now is I want to change gears. We're getting flooded with questions now from the audience, which I love. Thank you. Very engaged. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to direct it to a person, and we're going to move on to the next question to the next speaker. So this is what we're going to do. This question comes from Jeff. I'm going to direct it to you, Dr. Crowther. We saw that in Germany, the first cyber attack that led indirectly to a death, and the Germans chose not to reciprocate or engage or that we're aware of. Do you believe that a country like the United States will follow that as a precedent, or do you think each country will now redefine how it responds to such an attack of that nature?
So the Germans led the way to creating wars that killed tens of millions of people between 1871 and 1945. In response, the world disestablished the Prussian state, right? We split Germany in two, and we said, bad Germany, don't do that again. Well, they're not doing it again. I mean, politically, they have chosen a path that just doesn't allow for them to accuse somebody of doing something. They will, they say they will participate as part of NATO in defending other NATO allies, and that's about it. So it depends on the country, right? Some countries, back to the Melian dialogue, if you're a very small country and you get hit with a cyber operation, like Estonia in 2007, I noticed a comment about that, where the Russians allegedly took down the Estonians. No allegedly about it, man. They smoked the Estonian network, right? Which is why Estonia is now one of the top defensive cyber powers in the world, right? my Estonian friends say that you can do everything except die and get married online. Pay your taxes, vote, pay your all the rest of that stuff you can do. But you'll notice they didn't say, hey, Russia, we're coming for you, right? Because they can't, right? So there's countries that can and decide not to, like Germany, and I assume Japan's going to be the same way for the same reason. And then there's countries that can't do anything about it, like Estonia. So now we're down to who can do something about it, who will do something about it. And man, that's one hand, right? US, UK, Russia, China, right? And then you could probably throw in Australia and the Netherlands if you really wanted to. So those are the only ones who are going to publicize a cyber operation against them that meets the criteria of an armed attack and do something about it.
Excellent answer. Thank you, sir. And Director Fonseca, back to you. This question is from Michael. Given Russia's allegedly, quote unquote, ability to disable Estonia's critical infrastructure, so we're segueing from Dr. Crowther, in 2007 to include banking systems, how vulnerable are critical infrastructures in the US in 2021, considering that so many have received such poor health ratings? What can we do to combat these vulnerabilities? Excellent question.
So I see Michael's question now, and he put alleged in parentheses, and I think Alex is right. The Russians have been very hostile, in that part of the world, whether it's Estonia to the Ukraine, and they've leveraged cyber in very meaningful ways to try to advance their own national objectives and their, what they sort of call the near abroad. Here in the United States, when we talk about critical infrastructures, we got 16 critical infrastructures, and some are far more vulnerable than others. When you think about some of the more resilient critical infrastructures, it's, banking and finance, for example, is a critical infrastructure. Obviously was one of the earliest targeted, critical infrastructures, because that's where the money was. If you're gonna profit from hacking, then you go after, banking and financial institutions. And beyond that, defense contractor defense sector was pretty robust in terms of protecting. It took some early hits on the chin, from cyber attacks, and have worked really hard to build resilience. But when you look across the critical infrastructures, there's a lot. Communications also another one that's really increasingly resilient. First responders, things that are really vital. You've seen some expansive improvements in terms of protecting and mitigating cyber attacks. The ones that you see and that you wouldn't typically think of, I think, are on the rise now. And so one example is healthcare as a critical infrastructure. It's probably one of the fastest growing threat spaces because of the two things. One, the surge in online medical records, and then two, the amount of interconnected devices that are being used for health and medicine today is increasing that attack surface. And we've seen people pivot towards healthcare. And so it's been one of the most rapidly attacked. And then you see some of these other ones like water infrastructure water infrastructure, energy. I mean, electoral systems has been sort of infused into our 16 critical infrastructures. There's still a lot of vulnerabilities there. But one of the things that's really interesting, and actually Alex and I were talking about this recently, and I'll let Alex jump in on it, but was sort of the concept of air gapping, right? In which, you look at nuclear facilities, for example, they're air gapped. You're not going to be able to hack into a nuclear power plant and shut it down by way of sort of the web or cyberspace. I mean, you're going to have to breach the industrial control systems by going into that space because it's air gapped. And so air gapping is a tactic that's been used quite a bit to try to build resilience in some of these critical infrastructures that we can kind of take offline, right? You can't take healthcare offline, you can't take banking or finance offline, but you can take energy, elections, nuclear offline, and air gap in a way that it builds some firewall between external hacking and sort of internal security. I don't know if that answers Mike. Mike, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of vulnerabilities. Some may be more pronounced than others, but if you sort of map cyber all the way back to its origins in really thinking about security, critical infrastructure has become, was one of the early preoccupations of cyber threats. And that's why the agency today that is in charge of cyber at Homeland Security is CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And so again, infrastructure security is a part of it because of how vulnerable it's been historically and how much improvement needs to be made to continue to build resilience in those structures. Alex, go for it.
Yeah.
So DHS actually has a database of every infrastructure in the United States, every bridge, every tunnel, every mine. And then they've racked and stacked it. It's a classified document. Once you rack and stack it, it becomes a classified document. So if you run a bridge in South Dakota, they know you run a bridge in South Dakota. If you run a nuclear power plant, DHS is your best friend, right? And so they are, the more important you are, the more they offer to help you. And when it comes to nuclear power plants, the offer is one that you cannot refuse, right?
That's right.
Others have the option to do that, but the power grid and all the rest of that stuff, they don't have the capability to mandate many things. They can mandate some things when it comes to like safety and stuff like that. But that's what we're dealing with here. And what we're suffering from is an underinvestment in maintenance of our critical infrastructure. And so we've got to do something about it. And we're working on that. CISA is working on that, and companies are working on that as well. Congress has become a lot more involved. There were 3 major shortcomings legislatively. One was no requirement to report an operation against you. One was to mandate protection security for Internet of Things. And the third one was cyber hygiene, stuff like that, cyber education, right? There's no mandate for any of that. And so Congress last fall did do some legislation on IoT, Internet of Things, security. And right now, in the wake, because of the Capitol operation, the Capitol Pipeline's ransomware operation, they are talking about creating legislation that requires at least pipeline companies requiring them to report any cyber operation against them, because the Capitol people didn't report it, because most companies don't want to report this stuff. It's embarrassing. You can lose market share. Your stocks could tumble. And if your stockholders are particularly aggressive, if your company loses, just to use a fictional amount, $100 million, your stockholders can theoretically sue the company for that $100 million. Hey, I didn't get my dividend this year because the leadership of this company was stupid and didn't do proper cybersecurity. So we want our $100 million. And so there's a lot of motivation for companies not to report all this stuff. And so that's where we're at right now. And that's why Congress is talking about it. I don't think, because this is the United States, I don't think we're ever going to get to everybody has a mandate to report stuff. I do believe certain critical infrastructure sectors, pipelines, the electricity grid, maybe some transportation stuff, airlines, trains, stuff like that. I think we're going to see that in the near future.
So par for the course from the government, always a couple of steps behind in a legislative capacity, but we'll should see some changes in the future.
Regarding cyber, legislation is a lagging indicator. Always they're reacting. It's really interesting. Part of the problem is that, and I can say this because I am one, our senior leaders are old white guys and they don't get cyber, right? I actually have a Meet the Press transcript where Lindsey Graham proudly announces that he's never sent an email. And here's one of the leaders of the Senate responsible for cyber legislation. And so
it's just unbelievable, right?
So,
gentlemen, we're now in the fourth quarter of this, and I would be remiss if we did not touch upon the critical technology aspect of this critical technology summit.
Yeah,
Director Fonseca, go ahead.
I just want to make one point that we left unturned, and Alex sort of alluded to it. And I recall asking one of our leaders at CISA what kept him up at night, and his response to me was that 85% of America's critical infrastructure is in the hands of private sector. And so it's an enormous number. I've seen estimates down towards 80, but even so, 80 to 85% of America's critical infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector, which means it sits just on the outside, or at least in that space of regulatory, bodies that try to manage how these, private sector organizations are managing elements of American critical infrastructure. But that was the biggest concern, is that the central, the U.S. government could not, sort of manage that in a very easy way without having to compete and fight in that space with the private sector. So 85%, it's a big deal.
Excellent. No, and it just highlights the importance of the private sector and the private citizen in defending our interests as well in the cyberspace. I do want to get to the critical technology aspect of it being, of significant importance. Director Fonseca, you mentioned right off the bat, very early on, the impact of AI. Now, when I think of AI, I think of Alexa. Are we talking about Alexa? Or are we talking about Skynet here? What kind of AI and what is its impact on cyber capabilities, both offensively and defensively? And then we'll go to Dr. Crowther and see if he has another technology that I think that he thinks will play a major role in the future of cybersecurity.
Well, and I think, if I were to expand the question a little bit, I would probably, look at technology across the board, right? And how technology across the board is going to change the broader landscape within, not just the conflict space of sort of, warfare, but also on the intel space, right? Which definitely is a part of the broader warfare strategy, but intel being somewhat distinct. The specific answer to your question about AI and cybersecurity, again, kind of goes back to what I said earlier about the fact that AI is being used to kind of look for vulnerabilities, mitigate vulnerabilities, but AI is also being used to levy attacks, right? So AI-based attacks are becoming a little bit more proliferated, and I had a senior leader at Microsoft told me that that's what kept them at night, sort of a worm that could learn and move on its own without any human. Without any additional human guidance, and that can find the vulnerabilities in a system and attack, at the right time in the right place. And so, AI is definitely being brought into the cyber landscape, and I think in meaningful ways. And so that's going to continue. But as you start to think about, the application of AI more broadly speaking, across sort of warfare and, in intel, there's one sort of application and how it's being used. The other is the ethics or the concern around, sort of ethical standards. And so one often case study that's brought up in these discussions are, can you give a machine the decision-making authority around the use of force or lethality, right? And so there's all this talk now about machines being deployed in the battlefield to fight wars, and the U.S. is certainly developing, it's technology soldier that can deploy. I think the Russians, the last I read, the Russians had like a standing commitment of roughly 30% of their ground troops to be in the form of machines. And so it's definitely, the machines and AI is being sort of infused in warfare. And so that ethics piece, though, is a little unique in that, it's largely us kind of debating whether or not we can give lethality, or the kind of access, free reign access information to machines to be able to levy them in times of war or conflict. The one debate I remember hearing was you take there's a difference between sort of offense and defense, right? And so if you may have far more latitude in giving machines decision-making capability, removing humans from the loop, if you will, if you're on defense as opposed to being on offense. But one of the interesting case study was the use of surface-to-air missiles, right? And whether or not, that split-second decision that it might take a human to, attack an incoming aircraft that was going to drop bombs, whether that mattered in any meaningful way to enable, again, the case to be made that you can give those machines that ability to fire. So it's one of those ethical debates, but okay, so you can imagine that whether it's drones or robots or vehicles all sort of being driven by sophisticated technology, you also have on the Intel side, a plethora of potential uses. I remember a study by Deloitte that kind of put out a series of sample case studies in which AI was going to be fused into intelligence, and it was sort of wide ranging, everything from, kind of evaluating the reliability of sources to monitoring and image checking, vehicles, people, things like that, to AI and machine learning being able to sort of move through massive amounts of information to help inform decision making in really sophisticated ways that were far more powerful than maybe just a group of Intel analysts. And so there's a large range of AI applications in the Intel space as well. And I'll end here and open it back up to Alex, but whether it's cognitive language, computer vision, predictive analytics, all of this stuff is being leveraged in advancing the Intel mission in powerful ways.
So Dr. Crowther, are we going to piggyback off of AI and the discussion that Director Fonseca put forth on the ethical considerations of AI and its implications, or are you going to lead us in a new direction with a new technology that we should be considering?
You tasked me with coming up with another technology. I'm happy that Brian got the easy one, which is AI. I will say, just as the ethics of AI, one parenthetical, the United States has declared openly that we're going to keep a person in the loop with AI, lethal AI, so that the wrong people don't get killed. Honestly, the Chinese and the Russians don't care who they kill. So they're not going to do that. So their AI is going to be faster than their lethal AI is going to be faster than our lethal AI, because we're going to have a person in the loop. That's neither good nor bad. It's just the state of play. So since you asked for another technology other than AI, I would offer.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
Brian, we can't hear you.
Alex, the hard one. Give him quantum.
There you have it.
I can talk about quantum if you want.
What were you going to go with? I know you were giving.
I was going to go with big data.
Okay.
And so it's harder and harder to hide when there's big data, right? Which is,
can you give us a very quick definition of big data for those of us that are not as
so it's the plethora of data that's out there, right? And so Brian and I were talking about this earlier. If you're storing everything in the cloud, you don't have to break into my office and my hard drive. You just go to go to the cloud and sift through everything and find my stuff, right? So big data is an agglomeration of all the information. The smart cities, for instance, they've got sensors on buildings and stuff like that. Wind speed, temperature, what's in the air, medical, procedures, sensors that are so medical data is hugely important and stuff like that. And so it's harder and harder to hide, right? It used to be when you did an operation, clandestine operation, they'd issue you a new passport and a story, right? And that was good. As long as you could talk well drilling, you could be Sam the well driller. Nowadays, when you show up as Sam the well driller, somebody does a Google search on Sam the well driller and discovers that there's nothing on the internet on Sam the well driller before a year ago. Right. And so, hey, we need to take a closer look at this Sam guy. right? So that's part of it is it's much harder to do clandestine things. It's much harder to hide airplanes and ships and submarines and stuff like that because of all the platforms we have running around giving us data. Yeah, I'm always seeing stories about, hey, look at that submarine. I wonder what that's doing there, stuff like that. So it's going to be harder and harder to surprise anybody because of the plethora of information out there. Also, it's going to be harder and harder to protect your information. This is why in cybersecurity, you have to tier your protection, right? And so you can only super protect the crown jewels is what they call them, right? So nuclear technology, stuff like that. What's the president saying? All that stuff. And the rest of it, they're going to get into, and it's all out there. And so this provides an opportunity for a digitized society like our own to use this information to do stuff better. But it's also a threat to us and an opportunity to our adversaries who can use this information against us. Again, back to the Chinese and the intellectual property theft. If all your intellectual property theft is on the web, they just steal it, right? They don't have to break into your office again.
So my question to both of you right now is, I'm going to make a bold assumption here that the United States is still, oh, Director Fonseca, you like to add, go ahead.
I was just going to say something, kind of jumping on what Alex said. He and I talked earlier and we were sort of talking about, and I thought it would be important to bring up sort of the trends that are occurring in this technology space that, are and will continue to have impact going forward. And they've all at some point been sort of infused in the discussion, but it'd be interesting. I think it'd be worthy of just sort of calling attention to it. We talked about AI and we talked about big data, and those are two overwhelmingly rapid trends that we're seeing, happen sort of in broader cyberspace. The other things that are happening that I think are still, importantly meaningful, and that is sort of the growth in mobile devices, right? Mobile device and our ability to be mobile with systems is changing fast. Computing power is also changing. This gets to the point on quantum that we sort of touched on, but this idea that computing speed continues to get faster and faster. And then you also have sort of the surge in IoT devices, which we talked about earlier, right? So cloud computing, AI, mobile devices, Internet of Things, computing speed, big data are all really important trends that are happening that are changing this landscape of critical technology and the security sort of nexus. So I at least wanted to flag that and just kind of toss that out.
I think it's an excellent addition and excellent comment. Thank you for it. I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to make a bold assumption here in saying that the United States remains the leader in terms of these technological advancements. But what kind of a missile gap are we talking about here? Are we on the right side of it? Or are we in danger of being overtaken by some of our geopolitical rivals in the near future? And I want to front this to the both of you because I do want to hear the thoughts on both of you.
That's a loaded question, Aldo. It's a loaded question, but I think it's a valuable.
Only kind that I know.
Look, what's interesting is that the United States is both the most powerful country in cyberspace, and at the same time, the most vulnerable power in cyberspace, right? So while we have tremendous capability, we're also the most connected, right, around the world. And that makes us incredibly vulnerable for all the reasons that we've talked about over the last hour and 15 minutes. And so, you pose
that's sort of the paradox of technology, though, as a nation that's highly advanced and all our citizens have access and are connected. Does it have to be that way? By reaching for that technological advancement, do we simultaneously reach for all those vulnerabilities and there's nothing we can do about it?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, there's something we can do about it. Whether or not we're doing it as fast and furious as we need to protect, our society, that's a whole nother question. But Alex laid out the importance of cyber hygiene and building cyber resilience across society. I mean, that's part and parcel of being, the most connected to cyberspace. But at the same time, our adversaries and rivals will take advantage of that connectivity, and they'll leverage, whatever technological capacity they have, to advance their objectives vis-a-vis or sort of against the United States. And if that's attacking supply chains or individuals in the hope that it aggregates up and creates panic, or access to massive amounts of valuable information, or industrial control systems to shut things down. I mean, that's all out there, and part of the reality that we are incredibly powerful in cyberspace, and that vulnerability is inherent. I think the spirit of your question, though, was kind of leading us down this path of US-China competition, right? If I were to kind of take a swing at what rival you were talking about that might pass us, is of course the People's Republic of China and the PRC capturing so much attention.
I make no assertion.
I mean, that's what I read, and I'm going to take it as such. And look, I think that if you look at that competition, the competition taking place in the technology space is really important. The United States and China both respect the importance of technology as a source of national power, and we're both pursuing it as such. And I think in some cases the Chinese have attempted to outpace us. When you look at the portfolio of cyber companies out there and AI companies out there, Chinese firms are rivaling American firms. They're also out competing America in certain markets around the world where they're sort of peddling their technology. I think where they're not winning is winning the war on narrative, right? I mentioned narrative in cyberspace as being an element of national power, according to Adam Siegel in his book Hack World Order. And I don't think the Chinese are winning the narrative in cyberspace. They're not. And I think that remains their biggest weakness in terms of their ability to compete in this space, right? China can proliferate as much routers and digital infrastructure vis-a-vis Huawei and ZTE. But that narrative of sort of digital authoritarianism is only popular, by the way, with countries that rely on it in order to preserve power. And these are often already autocratic leaning regimes, right? Or countries in the world. And so, again, I think we outcompete the Chinese in terms of narratives in cyberspace, but they're rapidly catching up on us in terms of hardware capability. I don't think they're there yet. But they are moving very fast, and they recognize the importance of quantum computing. They recognize the importance of 5G, and eventually we'll get to 6G. That competition is real, and it's not a decisive victory for the United States to have the overwhelming advantage. The Chinese are closing that gap, and in some areas like AI, they may be nudging past us in certain spaces. Alex, I don't know if you have a different take on that, but
I do. I personally believe that China has hit a glass ceiling. I believe that Xi's authoritarian tendencies have taken him over. You notice he crushed the Ant Group recently. Notice that they banned cryptocurrency recently. Notice that they limited children's access to gaming platforms to an hour on Friday and Saturday night.
I followed that page in my house. I followed that page and I put my
well,
kids.
I mean, so what you're saying is you have a proto-authoritarian household, Brian?
You know what? I don't necessarily.
Oh, you're full-blown authoritarian household. Okay.
Yeah, but it's the mom and the wife that leads that rules.
It's a lifestyle choice. It's okay, right?
It's not me. That's for sure.
It's not Brian.
Anyway, I believe that they're killing the goose that laid the golden egg, right? Their wolf warrior diplomats have managed to scare everybody. The Belt and Road Initiative, they only had to take a couple of ports as collateral before everybody else said, hey, I better not put my port. I better not sign a contract that says they can take my port if I don't pay them, because they'll take my port, right? They're in the port of Mombasa now, actually in Kenya. The port I'm referring to is in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lanka government put this port up as collateral in a contract. They couldn't pay the Chinese, so the Chinese took this port. And so they're scaring everybody. So their buddies are fellow authoritarians, rule by law countries. All the rule of law countries are coming together against them. And so I think their overall driving need to control everything is going to kill their innovation. And all the things that if you're interested, a guy named Min-Ching Pei from Claremont McKenna. Another one is Gordon Chang, who talk about the limitations of China, demographic problems, economic problems, 300% of GDP debt, stuff like that, and the environmental issues, all sorts of bad things happening in China. I'm not a Min-Ching Pei guy because he seems to imply that, they're going to fall tomorrow. I don't think they're going to do that. But I think they've pretty much topped out in terms of their ability to compete. And now that they're there, they believe that they've passed us, right? And so now that they're there, they're saying, oh, well, we don't have to innovate anymore because I'll just tell the economy what to do, right? And Xi Jinping, no matter how much he says, you boys better make some jobs. If there's no innovation going on, there's no new jobs, right? And so Alex's personal opinion, and 10 years from now, you can come back and watch this video. I believe that the Chinese have topped out.
So two divergent perspectives from two cybersecurity experts. That's what makes this discussion so interesting and worthwhile. And gentlemen, honestly, I think we could discuss this for a whole week straight every day, and we would never run out of topics. I think we should propose a podcast, a weekly podcast. We'll call it Between Two Bookcases or Head Cases, depending on the topic we're discussing, right? And I just want to thank you both for the outstanding insight. I know that our audience members were very engaged with the questions, really enjoyed the discussion. Parting thoughts for the, this is the future of the intelligence workforce, hopefully, that we're speaking to. Parting thoughts or recommendations for them. They're certainly not the Lindsey Grahams of the world. These are students who are digital natives. And what would you like to see from this upcoming generation, future intelligence professionals within this realm, within this environment, sir? And I'll start with Director Fonseca, and Dr. Crowther will end with you.
So, I mean, look, I think, it's an interesting question. And so if you were asking me to part some, small wisdom on the digital natives that are sort of following, Dr. Crowther and I into the national security spaces, it would be continue to lean in on the future technologies. Those are important competencies, but don't lose sight of the valuable soft skills in the history that is really powerful in helping us understand how, these technologies will be used and how we leverage them, in the future. But definitely lean in on it. And that's a little different than sort of us digital immigrants. We know technology and the power of technology is there. But there's a tendency for digital immigrants to be apprehensive about the use of technology, just like Lindsey Graham in the analogy that Alex gave. But I would say continue to lean in on technology. It's only going to get faster. Tectonic shifts in technology was happening maybe every decade or so in the latter part of the last century. Tectonic shifts in technology are happening far more rapidly now. And so there's a continuous learning cycle around, technology and the use of technology in a variety of different applications. So continue to lean in on it, definitely.
And Dr. Crowther?
So I already did this in 2 words. So I used that round. So I'll do it in 5 words. Don't click on the link. Real simple.
Excellent. Well, words of wisdom right there. You'll be singing that one until all your time at JGI is done right at the university. So definitely words of wisdom there. I want to thank the both of you for your time today. Exceptional discussion. Really did enjoy that. The discussion, the questions from the audience were fantastic. Guillermo Planos has already endorsed our weekly podcast. We'll just tweak the name a little bit and we'll come back with some options for everyone. And that
words
being
of
said,
wisdom.
How about
words of wisdom, right?
in between 2 old white guys? I don't know. To go off of what Alex said.
About, digital immigrants.
I think we got
digital.
So we got some options.
Lecture digital natives on digital stuff.
So we got some options. That being said, I want to remind everyone in the audience to again visit our JGI, the Gordon Institute.edu for all of upcoming events. We'll be hosting the DHS's Homeland Security Investigations October 15th, if memory serves. And we hope that you all participate in that, as well as our October 8th Insider's Guide to Careers in National Security. For the Jack D. Gordon Institute, I want to thank Director Brian Fonseca, Dr. Alexander Crowther, and I am Aldo, and we are signing off. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for attending today's event.
Thank you.
Thanks.